The noise of the cafe was a physical thing, a wave of clattering forks and overlapping conversations that pushed against her temples. Eliza clutched the tray, holding her wilting salad and lukewarm soup, her light blue hospital scrubs feeling thin and inadequate armor against the lunchtime rush. Every table was a fortress of occupied chairs. Every single one. A familiar anxiety, cold and sharp, pricked at the base of her throat. She could go back to the hospital break room, with its sterile silence and the lingering scent of antiseptic, but she had needed to escape it, just for 30 minutes. She had needed air that didn't taste of recycled grief. There was one empty seat. Just one. It was at a small table for two in the corner, tucked away from the main flow of traffic. A man sat there, nursing a small cup of espresso, his back to the wall. He was a pocket of absolute stillness in the surrounding chaos. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, the kind of material that seemed to drink the light and give nothing back. He hadn't looked up, hadn't moved a muscle, yet she felt his awareness of the room, a quiet, gravitational pull. Asking a stranger to share a table was a circle of social hell she actively avoided. Her shyness was a physical barrier, something she had to push through with exhausting effort for every minor interaction. But the alternative was standing awkwardly in the middle of the floor until her break was over. She took a breath, a small, inadequate preparation for the ordeal. She walked toward him, her worn sneakers silent on the tiled floor. "Excuse me," she began, her voice barely a whisper, forcing herself to raise it. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but would you mind if I sat here? There's nowhere else." The man finally lifted his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if he were conserving energy for something more important. His eyes were not brown, as she'd expected, but a startling, cold shade of gray, like a winter sky over the ocean. They assessed her in a single, sweeping glance that took in the exhaustion under her eyes, the faint stain on her scrubs, the nervous way she held her tray. It was not a leering look. It was something far more unnerving. It was an inventory.
"No," he said.
His voice was low, a gravelly sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, and it held no warmth at all. For a second, she thought he was refusing. A hot flush of humiliation crept up her neck. Of course. Why would he want a stranger intruding on his quiet? She started to stammer an apology, to retreat. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand toward the empty chair. "No, I do not mind." Relief warred with a new, formless apprehension. She slid into the chair, carefully placing her tray on the table. The silence that settled between them was heavy, weighted. It was different from the silence of strangers ignoring each other. This felt curated. He returned his attention to his espresso, lifting the small cup with a hand that was unnaturally steady. A heavy, dark metal signet ring sat on his little finger, its surface worn smooth. It looked old and expensive. She tried to focus on her salad, forcing down limp lettuce and watery dressing. She was acutely aware of him, of the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, a mix of cedar and something else she couldn't name. It was a subtle, expensive smell that didn't belong in a cheap cafe next to a city hospital. Everything about him was a contradiction to this place. The suit, the stillness, the unnerving quiet. He moved like the room owed him space. A phone on the table beside his cup vibrated, a low, urgent buzz. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Without looking away from the street outside the window, he reached out and silenced it, his long fingers pressing the screen with finality. Eliza risked a glance at his face. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable, carved from something hard. He wasn't relaxing. He was waiting. That was the moment she understood. This man wasn't having lunch. He was holding court, and the corner table was his throne. She was an accidental tourist in a kingdom she hadn't known existed. She ate faster, the food tasteless in her mouth. She just needed to finish, to thank him, to escape the suffocating weight of his presence. Suddenly, two men in dark coats entered the cafe. They didn't scan the room for a table. Their eyes went directly to him. They moved with a shared, predatory grace, parting the crowd without touching anyone. They stopped a few feet from their table. The man in the suit, her silent table mate, did not turn to acknowledge them. He simply lifted his espresso cup and drained the last of it. Dante, the taller of the two men, said, his voice low and respectful. "It's time." The man, Dante, placed his cup back on the saucer. The sound was a soft, definitive click. He looked at Eliza then, and for the first time, his eyes held a flicker of something other than cold assessment. It might have been annoyance. It might have been something else. "Your break is over," he stated. It wasn't a question. She looked at the clock on the wall, startled. He was right.
Oh, yes.
"Thank you." She fumbled with her tray, gathering the paper napkin and plastic fork, her hands clumsy. The two men watched her, their faces blank and impassive. She felt like a mouse being observed by a pair of well-fed cats. She stood up, her legs unsteady. "Thank you for letting me sit here." He gave a slight, dismissive nod, his attention already elsewhere. He was leaving. She turned and practically fled, weaving through the tables and pushing the door open, desperate for the familiar, grimy air of the city street. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was just a strange lunch. A weird, intense man. She would forget about it by the time she was back on the ward. But as she hurried across the street, she reached into her scrub pocket for her keys and found it empty. A cold dread washed over her. Her hospital ID, her apartment key, everything. She must have dropped them when she stood up so quickly. She spun around, her eyes locking on the cafe window just as Dante and his two men were walking out. He held her keys in his hand, dangling from his finger by the blue hospital lanyard. He had seen them fall. He had picked them up. He stopped on the sidewalk, waiting for her. The world she thought she was in was just a cafe. But the world she was actually in was standing on a Brooklyn sidewalk, holding the keys to her entire life in his hand. And now, she had to walk back to him to get them. She could not leave. The walk across the street felt 100 miles long. The city traffic seemed to slow, the sounds fading into a dull roar in her ears. Dante watched her approach, his expression unchanged. His men stood slightly behind him, silent sentinels. They formed a triangle of intimidation. She was now forced to enter. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands clenched at her sides. "You have my keys." He looked down at the lanyard in his hand, at the plastic card with her picture and her name, Eliza Rowe, registered nurse. He read it silently, his gray eyes lingering on her face on the card before lifting to meet hers. He held them out. "You should be more careful," he said. The words were a simple statement of fact, but they landed with the weight of a judgment. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the keys. His skin was cool, his touch brief, but it sent a strange jolt up her arm. It felt like touching a live wire. "Thank you," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on the pavement. She expected him to turn and leave, to dismiss her from his world as easily as he had allowed her into it. He did not. He remained standing there, watching her. "Brooklyn General," he said, his gaze flicking toward the hospital complex down the street. "It's a good hospital." "It's a busy hospital," she corrected, the ingrained response of any overworked nurse. A ghost of something, not quite a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "Some people owe their lives to the nurses there." His voice was different now. Quieter. The gravelly edge was still there, but it was layered over something else. Something that sounded like old, settled pain. The statement was so unexpected, so personal, that it broke through her anxiety. She looked up and met his eyes again. "We do our best." "I know," he said. And the way he said it, with a chilling certainty, made her feel as though he had been watching her. As if he knew exactly how many hours she worked, how many lives she fought for in the chaotic, bloody theater of the emergency room. It was impossible. It was also a feeling she couldn't shake. He gave a final, sharp nod. "Be careful, Eliza Rowe." He said her name. He had read it off her ID, but hearing it in his voice was different. It sounded like a possession. A warning. He turned then, and he and his men walked down the street, melting into the city as if they were made of its shadows. Eliza stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching her keys so tightly the metal bit into her palm. She told herself it was nothing. An odd encounter with a wealthy, eccentric man. She had her keys. It was over. But as she walked back to the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It was just beginning. 2 weeks passed. The memory of the man in the cafe began to fade, softened by the relentless tide of 12-hour shifts and the sheer exhaustion that followed. It became just another strange city story, a brief encounter with one of New York's many intense, unknowable figures. She worked, she slept, she paid her bills. Her life was a closed, predictable loop. Then one Tuesday night, the loop broke. The doors to the ER burst open, and paramedics rushed in with a man on a gurney. Gunshot wounds. It wasn't an uncommon sight in this part of Brooklyn, but this felt different. The man on the gurney was one of the men who had been with Dante in the cafe. The taller one. His face was pale, contorted in pain, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a soldier's awareness. Behind the gurney, walking with that same unnerving calm she remembered, was Dante Moretti. He looked different without the suit. He wore dark jeans and a soft, black cashmere sweater that did nothing to hide the breadth of his shoulders. But the stillness was the same. The absolute control. He ignored the frantic energy of the ER, his gaze fixed on his man. His eyes swept the room, and then they found her. There was no surprise in his expression. Only a dark, grim acknowledgement. A senior nurse directed the gurney to Trauma Bay 3. "Ro, you're with me," she called out, and Eliza's training took over. The shy, anxious woman who couldn't ask for a seat in a cafe disappeared. In her place was a nurse. Calm, focused, efficient. She pulled on gloves, her mind already running through protocols, assessing the visible wounds, anticipating the doctor's orders. She moved into the trauma bay, her world shrinking to the patient on the table. She cut away the man's blood-soaked shirt, her movements quick and precise. 2 wounds. One in the shoulder, one in the abdomen. Bad, but maybe not fatal if they were fast. As she worked, she was aware of Dante standing just outside the curtain, a silent, imposing shadow. He wasn't yelling or demanding. He was simply watching, observing her, trusting her to do her job. The weight of that trust was heavier than any demand. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Blood bags, for lines, monitors beeping a frantic rhythm. The patient, whose name she learned was Nico, was stabilized for surgery. As they wheeled him out, Eliza peeled off her bloody gloves, her adrenaline finally starting to ebb, leaving a familiar weariness in its place. She turned to dispose of the medical waste and found Dante standing right there, just inside the bay. He had moved so silently, she hadn't heard him. "He will live?" Dante asked. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his gray eyes were locked on her face, searching. "The surgeon will know more. We stopped the bleeding. We stabilized him. He has a good chance," she said, her professional tone a shield. Dante nodded slowly. He looked at the blood on the floor, then at the small smear of it on her cheek she hadn't realized was there. He lifted his hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to touch her. Instead, his fingers hovered an inch from her skin. "You have blood on your face." She flinched back, her hand flying up to wipe it away. The shield of her professionalism cracked. She was just Eliza again, a 24-year-old nurse standing too close to a man who radiated a quiet, lethal danger. "Thank you," she whispered. He let his hand drop. His gaze was intense, analytical. "In the cafe, you were timid. Here, you are not." "This is my job," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I know what I'm doing here." "Yes," he said, a strange resonance in the word. "You do." He looked around the trauma bay, at the discarded, blood-stained supplies. His jaw tightened. "My brother, Marco, he was not so lucky. The doctors were too slow. The nurse was careless, the admission was stark, stripped of any sentimentality, but the pain beneath it was a raw, exposed nerve. He was sharing a piece of his wound, and she had no idea why. It was the reason. the reason for the scholarship that had paid her way through nursing school. The anonymous grant from a foundation she'd never been able to properly thank. It was him. He was trying to create the nurse his brother never had. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This man, this dangerous, cold man, had shaped the last 4 years of her life without her ever knowing. Her career, her ability to stand here in this room, was owed to him, to his grief. He must have seen the shock on her face. A flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed his features. "My driver will take you home," he said, his voice returning to that flat, commanding tone. "It's late. It's not safe." "I can take the subway," she protested, a feeble attempt to reclaim some control. That was not a request. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the blood-spattered room, the entire foundation of her world tilting on its axis. She could have refused. She could have gone to her locker, changed, and walked to the subway station as she always did. But she didn't. She thought of his quiet, ancient pain. She thought of the way he watched her work, as if he were seeing a ghost redeemed.
So she did as he said.
She went outside, and a black, sleek car was waiting for her, a silent promise of a world she had no business entering, a world that had, it turned out, owned a piece of her all along. The car was an island of silent luxury. The leather seats were cool against her tired back, and the city slid by the tinted windows in a blur of muted light. She felt Dante's presence in the car's quiet hum, in the respectful silence of the driver. He was everywhere and nowhere. When the car pulled up to her shabby apartment building in a part of Brooklyn that never slept, the driver got out and opened her door. "Mr. Moretti said to ensure you got inside safely," the man said, his voice polite but firm. Eliza nodded, unable to speak. She walked up the 3 flights of stairs, the silent driver waiting by the car until she had unlocked her door and disappeared inside. She leaned against the door, her heart pounding. This was more than a ride home. It was a message. She was under his watch. Because she had done her job well, because she had saved his man, she was no longer just an anonymous nurse. She was Eliza Rowe. And Dante Moretti knew where she lived. Therefore, she was no longer safe. Her competence had made her a liability. The knowledge should have terrified her. It did. But beneath the fear was a strange, unsettling current of connection. He had seen her at her most capable, and he hadn't flinched from the blood and the chaos. He had seen the person she was beneath the shyness. And he had, in his own way, protected her. A week later, she understood the true nature of that protection. She was leaving the hospital after another grueling shift, the sun a pale, watery smudge in the evening sky. A man stepped out from between 2 parked cars, blocking her path. He wasn't big, but he moved with a wiry, restless energy that set her teeth on edge. "Eliza Rowe?" he asked. He smiled, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. Her blood ran cold. He wasn't one of Dante's men. "Who's asking?" she said, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. "A friend of a friend," he said, taking a step closer. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne rolled off him. "You're the nurse who patched up Nico Gallo. You did good work. Too good." She started to back away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," he sneered. "Here's the thing. Mr. Moretti, he values his people. So we're going to send him a message."
About how valuable they are.
"And how easy they are to break." He lunged for her. She didn't scream. Her training, the countless hours of de-escalation and emergency response, kicked in. She dropped her bag and sidestepped, using his momentum against him. He stumbled, catching himself on a car. It bought her a second.
She ran.
Not toward her apartment, but back toward the lights of the hospital. He was faster. He caught her by the arm, his fingers digging in like claws. He spun her around, his face inches from hers. "Big mistake," he hissed. Then, from the darkness, a shape detached itself. A black car, the same one that had taken her home, screeched to a halt beside them. The passenger door flew open, and Dante Moretti emerged. He moved not with speed, but with a terrifying, fluid economy of motion. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply closed the distance. The man holding her saw him, and his eyes widened in genuine terror. "More Eddie," he breathed, his grip slackening for a fraction of a second. It was all Eliza needed. She stomped her heel down hard on his instep. He yelped in pain, his hand flying off her arm. In that instant, Dante was there. He moved past Eliza, shielding her with his body. There was a series of short, brutal sounds. A sickening crack. A choked gasp. When she looked again, the man was on the ground, unconscious or worse. Dante stood over him, breathing evenly, his hands empty. He hadn't broken a sweat. He turned to her. His gray eyes were black with a cold, controlled fury. He scanned her from head to toe, checking for injuries. "Did he hurt you?" His voice was a low growl. "No," she whispered, her body trembling with delayed shock.
"I'm okay."
He reached out and gently took her arm, his thumb brushing over the red marks where the other man had grabbed her. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "This is my fault," he said, his voice raw. "You were never supposed to be a part of this. The scholarship, it was meant to keep you safe. To put someone good in the world, separate from me. Clean." There it was. The confession. Not of love, but of a desperate, failed attempt at atonement. He had tried to build a wall between his world and his penance, and she had just walked right through it. "He would have killed me," she said, the reality of it settling into her bones. "Yes," Dante said, his gaze never leaving hers. "And now I have to kill him." He looked down at the man on the ground with utter detachment. There was no mercy in his face, only calculation. This was her moment to run, to scream for the police, to get as far away from this man and his lethal world as possible. Instead, she looked at the man on the ground, then back at Dante. She saw the heavy burden he carried, the responsibility for his man, for his brother, and now for her. She saw the man who had secretly given her a future. "His shoulder," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "When you hit him, it dislocated." "I heard it." She took a step closer, her medical mind overriding her fear. "If you leave him like this, someone will find him. The police will come. They'll ask questions." Dante stared at her, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He had expected her to run. He had not expected her to help. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice laced with a dangerous curiosity. She took a deep breath. This was the line. Once she crossed it, there was no going back. "I'm suggesting you put him in your car. I can put the shoulder back in. It will hurt, but it's quiet. And it leaves less evidence than a trip to the ER." She was offering him her skill, not just as a nurse, but as an accessory. She was choosing a side. She was choosing his. A long, silent moment passed between them. The city hummed around them, oblivious. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a project, not as a victim, but as an accomplice. "Get in the car, Eliza," he said softly. And in his voice, she heard the sound of a door closing behind her forever. The final confrontation came on a rain-slicked night a month later. The rival family, the Albertis, were not content with sending a message. They wanted to burn Dante's world to the ground, and they had decided Eliza was the perfect match to light the fire. Dante had moved her into a secure apartment, a sterile, high-rise cage with bulletproof windows and men in the lobby. She was safe. She was also a prisoner. The tension between them was a constant, unspoken thing. He would sit in the armchair across from her in the evenings, watching her, the silence between them thick with everything he wouldn't say and everything she was too afraid to ask. The call came just after midnight. A blocked number. Dante answered, his body going rigid. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the color drain from his face. He listened, his gray eyes turning to stone. "Where?" he asked, his voice lethally calm. He listened again, then ended the call. "They have Nico," he said, his voice flat. "The man you saved. They want to trade him. For you." Ice flooded her veins. "They want me. They want to hurt me," he corrected, his eyes burning with a self-loathing so profound it was terrifying. "And you are how they mean to do it. This ends tonight." He was going to go. Alone. To sacrifice himself, or to walk into a trap. She saw it in the grim set of his jaw. The nurse in her, the woman who fixed things, who fought against the inevitable, rose up.
No, she said.
He looked at her, his expression unyielding. This is not your fight. You made it my fight when you put a scholarship in my name, she shot back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. You made it my fight when you saved me in that alley. You don't get to decide it's over now. What's your plan? Walk in there and get killed? What good does that do, Nico? I have no choice. Yes, you do, she insisted, her mind racing, connecting pieces of information she'd overheard, snippets of conversations. They want to meet at the old cannery on the pier, right? It's been abandoned for years. No power. It will be dark. She walked over to the small medical bag she had insisted on keeping with her. They're expecting you to come with guns. They aren't expecting a nurse. She pulled out a syringe and a small vial. This is a powerful sedative. Enough to knock a man out in seconds. But it needs to be injected directly into a major muscle. And this, she said, holding up a small canister, is ethyl chloride, a vapor-coolant spray. It causes a brief, intense freezing sensation, a distraction. He stared at her, at the tools of her trade transformed into weapons. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that you get me in there, she said, her heart hammering. They want the trade. They'll be focused on you. I'm just the package. But I'm a package they won't see coming.
It was a suicidal plan.
But it was a plan. It was better than watching him walk to his death. He argued. He refused. But she saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes.
He knew she was right.
It was the one advantage they had. The one thing the Albertis would never anticipate. The cannery stank of rust and dead fish. Rain lashed against the corrugated metal walls. Inside, it was a cavern of shadows, lit only by a few battery-powered lanterns that cast long, dancing ghouls on the walls. Nico was there, tied to a chair, his face bruised and swollen. 5 men stood around him, all holding guns. At their center was Marco Alberti, a man with dead eyes and a cruel smile. Moretti, Alberti called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. You came alone.
I'm touched.
And you brought the pretty nurse. Dante pushed Eliza slightly ahead of him, his hand resting on the small of her back. His touch was a silent promise. Let him go, Alberti. Your business is with me. My business is with whatever hurts you, Alberti sneered. And she seems to hurt you a great deal. Untie Nico. The boss wants to say hello to his girl. 2 of Alberti's men moved toward Nico. Dante's hand tightened on her back. Now, it seemed to say. Eliza stumbled, letting out a small, convincing cry of fear. My ankle, she gasped, falling to one knee. It was the opening she needed. As Alberti and his men focused on Dante, their attention momentarily diverted by her perceived weakness, she moved. She sprayed the ethyl chloride at the face of the man closest to her. He roared in surprise and pain, clawing at his eyes, blinded by the sudden, intense cold. In that same motion, she lunged toward the second man, the syringe appearing in her hand like a surgeon's scalpel. She drove the needle deep into his thigh, depressing the plunger. He grunted, swatting at her, but it was too late. His eyes glazed over, and he crumpled to the floor. Everything exploded into motion. Dante moved, a blur of controlled violence. Gunshots erupted, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. She crawled behind a pile of rusted machinery, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She had done her part. She had created the chaos. Now it was his world, the world of blood and noise. She watched as he fought. It was not a brawl. It was a kind of brutal choreography, precise, lethal, and terrifyingly efficient. He moved through the violence like it was his native language. One by one, the Alberti men fell. Finally, it was just him and Marco Alberti, circling each other in the flickering lantern light. A shot rang out. Dante cried out in pain, stumbling back, his hand flying to his side. Blood bloomed dark on his black sweater. Alberti smiled, raising his gun for the kill shot. Eliza acted. She didn't think. She grabbed a heavy, rusted pipe from the floor and ran. She swung it with all her strength, catching Alberti across the back of his knees. He howled, his legs buckling, his shot going wide. Dante was on him in an instant. The fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of the rain and Dante's harsh breathing. He stood over Alberti's body, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes dark and wide in the dim light. He was bleeding heavily. She ran to him. "Let me see," she commanded, her voice pure nurse. She pushed him down to sit against a wall, tearing at his sweater. The wound was deep. He was losing too much blood. "Eliza," he rasped, his hand covering hers. His eyes were locked on her face. He couldn't finish the sentence. "Don't talk," she ordered, pressing her hands against the wound. "You're going to be fine." She worked quickly, using strips of her own shirt to pack the wound, creating a pressure bandage. He never took his eyes off her. He watched her save him, just as she had saved Nico, just as she had been created to do. A cost had been paid. Nico was safe, but Dante was grievously wounded, and the floor of the cannery was littered with the price of their survival. Nothing in his world was free. Later, in the sterile quiet of his high-rise apartment, she stitched the wound on his side. The city glittered outside the vast window, a silent, beautiful witness. He was quiet, watching her hands as they moved with a practiced, steady rhythm. The needle dipped and rose, pulling the flesh together, closing the gap. She was mending him. When she was finished, she cleaned her tools, her movements methodical. He hadn't spoken a word. She could leave. She could walk out the door right now and disappear. He would not stop her. He had offered her the out once before. He would offer it again. She turned to face him. He was watching her, his gray eyes clear and intense. He looked at her, not as his project, not as a woman he had to protect, but as the woman who had run into the gunfire for him, the woman who had saved his life. "Eliza," he said, and her name was no longer a warning or a possession. It was an acknowledgement, a confession of a truth far deeper and more dangerous than any scholarship. It was everything. She didn't answer. She simply walked to the bathroom and came back with a warm cloth. She sat down beside him and began to gently wipe the blood and grime from his face. She made a choice, not with words, but with a quiet, deliberate touch. The shy nurse was gone. The woman who remained had seen his darkness, had walked through his fire, and had decided to stay. Her hand was steady as she tended to his wounds, claiming her place in the wreckage they had survived together.